we'd like to start just by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we are joining you. So that's the Darug people for myself, and the Awabakal people for Maddie, who's up in Newcastle Way. So hello to you from wherever you're joining us, and we pay respects to elders past, present, and to any Aboriginal people who are watching and joining us today. When I consider that there are 116,000 people experiencing homelessness every night, I think that really focuses the mind. And when I think about the number of women and children we were able to support in women's community shelters last year, and the work that we continue to do this year, it's a contribution to providing a solution to that number. Obviously, the longer term solution is housing for all of those individuals, and that's a longer term aim. But in the meantime, providing a roof overhead, particularly to people who are experiencing crisis, is always going to be a real priority. So identifying people who are at risk of homelessness, helping to provide and to facilitate a long-term housing solution, through the crisis period, through the medium-term period, and we also need a response and a larger government response to help us through provision of social housing and other more permanent housing solutions. But that shouldn't stop us from responding now.
Transitional housing is a bit of a step down from crisis, so it's really critical for those women and families who maybe require a longer period of support to get back on their feet. It gives them some time, I suppose, while they're still being supported by caseworkers and paying a very small amount of rent, to identify those longer term housing options. And I suppose what we find, and what all services are finding, is that the primary issue is affordability and access, like access to affordable housing. There just isn't enough social and affordable housing to support the people who need it, and that includes women and kids leaving domestic and family violence. Meanwhile Use identifies vacant or underutilised property, and it connects it with a community need. So in our case, we work with property developers, property owners, to identify housing or property that they're not using for a period of time, and we repurpose that to provide transitional housing and sometimes crisis accommodation for our clients.
So our transitional housing program began with a partnership with the PACE Foundation. And Maddie and I were actually in different organisations at that time, but we were working together with another of our housing partners, Bridge Housing, to build a partnership that I guess was innovative at the time, because each of our organisations had to adapt the ways in which we ordinarily worked. And by that I mean Bridge Housing modified some of the ways in which it provided its tenancy support. The PACE Foundation and PACE modified the typical kind of head lease or lease arrangement it might have with a tenant. And Women's Community Shelters was coordinating the partnership and ensuring the support was provided on the ground. So it was the first agreement that we put in place for Pathways Home, which Maddie will talk a little bit more about. And that transitional housing was initially 5 properties, and it's expanded considerably since then. And the community housing partners have become really critical friends and partners in trying to build the capacity of Meanwhile Use as a housing type, in terms of being able to support that medium-term tenancy.
The benefits of Meanwhile Use housing are that it's a really immediate response to to those people who are experiencing homelessness and financial vulnerability right now, it definitely doesn't meet the whole need. It meets a very small portion of that need, but it is something really practical that we can do using the resources that are available to us. Over the last 12 months, we've actually seen an increase of 294% in the number of bed nights we've been able to offer, transitional housing bed nights that we've been able to offer. And I think at last count, we've supported around 130 women and children transitional housing and the support that accompanies that. For a lot of our families, that period of stability and support really gives them space to heal from the trauma of family and domestic violence, but also to engage in training and education, employment that will set them up for a really successful future.
So that increase in almost 300% in the number of bed nights we've been able to provide, it would be remiss of us not to call out the partners who have been really integral in enabling and supporting that expansion. So PACE Foundation, we've mentioned already, Lend Lease and the Future Steps program, they have been amazing in their support, and that's really enabled us to again try and increase and scale up the program. Our community housing providers, having two different agencies responsible for those roles is really important. So, you know, a big shout out to community housing providers. They're, you know, an essential solution to resolving the access to housing and the way in which housing is provided in the community, but they, you know, need the support and investment to get there too. But private developers and private property owners as well have worked with us in fantastic ways to be able to provide options for use of their properties in ways that, you know, ensure their rights as a property owner and enable us to provide housing solutions. And we're incredibly grateful to each and every one of those supporters. The census gives us the data around the increases that we're seeing in women's homelessness. They are the fastest growing proportion of the population that are at risk or vulnerable to the experience of homelessness. And what our projects at Beecroft and Mossman House have found is that many of the women who have come to be accommodated there were experiencing financial vulnerability where they were. So they were housed, but they were paying, you know, over 75% of their income for their rent, or they were housed in situations such as boarding houses, which were insecure and unsafe. And what we've aimed to do through providing access to that accommodation is just give some a period of respite, a period where their rent is affordable, where there's a caseworker on site who can help with needs that they might have that is specific to those individuals, but is about setting down the foundations for, you know, the next stages of their life. A number of those women had no idea that they were eligible for social housing. And they were, you know, bearing the financial impacts of having to meet the costs of housing in the context of, as we all know, house prices increasing, rents increasing, and with a sense that they just had to make do. So I think we talk about isolation, and for that particular group, you know, that really worries us. I was really pleased through the consultations that we did with the women at Beecroft and at Mossman that they identified the value of being in community with other women as one of the things that was supportive. I think it's a really strong outcome of that model. I think there's definitely elements of the model which we will continue to refine. At Beecroft House, we're not able to provide everyone their individual bathroom. It's a bathroom shared between two. At Mossman House, there's individual bathrooms. Certainly things like that. We're continuing to look at amenity and dignity and all of those really important things, and ensuring that women are getting the support they need to know what the next steps in their journey are. So we're not, creating more anxiety while they're accommodated with us.
So our aspiration, I suppose, for the project is that we can continue to increase our offering of affordable, secure accommodation for women and children. We can only do that in partnership with property owners and community housing providers. The goal is to continue to grow our network of supporters. We've, over the last 3 years, we've really diversified the offering, I suppose. Like, we started working in one very specific way with one developer, and we have been able to adapt and change our offering based on the needs of each of our property partners. So we now work just with individuals who may have what was an investment property that they would really like to now direct towards a social need. Particularly in this COVID environment, I think people have come to reflect on their privilege and what they have, and how lucky they really are not to be. Well, I think I've heard Sim say before, like, I think people have really got a new sense of the meaning of home, and having to spend all of this time at home. I think that we have a new appreciation for what life might be like for those people who don't have that security. So we have seen a lot of interest from the broader community, wanting to find ways to give in a way that's meaningful and makes sense for them. And so property is one of the ways that people have started to do that, which is really exciting.
Maddie, you're absolutely right. So I think one of the things that we've done that's been really interesting to see evolve is that the portfolio now spans the individual right through to the larger social services provider in our aged care partners. Working with government is obviously still an option we'd like to explore, and we know the New South Wales government has a housing strategy that identifies meanwhile use of underutilised government assets as part of the solution. We would love to see access to those particular properties, as part of the Pathways Home project in the future. And I think one of the other areas that we'd like to see addressed, and that government has the power to kind of move on, is in terms of the planning controls that are around meanwhile use, making sure that there is a timely access to appropriate use of those properties, not to circumvent the proper planning process, but to acknowledge that when a property owner says to you, I've got a property that's available for 2 years, you really want to activate that as quickly as possible. Often those properties do need some work to make them fit for occupancy, so that takes time out of that equation, and we really are looking at maximising the time that people are safely housed. That lets us do the work that we need to do to help them identify what the next steps in the pathway are. Meanwhile use housing is not the solution to homelessness. Investment in social housing and our housing infrastructure is part of that solution, but it's absolutely a tangible and practical and much more immediate response. And I think it would be unethical for us not to be able to really leverage the resources and the commitments and the partnerships that we can to provide housing solutions, to provide homes for women and kids, for people who are at risk and need that additional support now.